Okay, well, I'm sitting down here with SP Nistades in his studio here in Hollywood, California, and we're here to talk about his background and his recent score for Dragon Age Redemption, which he just finished. And I guess just to start off, how did you get into music, and what made you want to compose for the visual mediums?
Well, I started off as a classical pianist, back in Thailand, and I kind of grew up with that, and then became part of an opera company in Thailand, and studied conducting, and eventually, of course, that led to classical composition. And it was really a lot of fun, and coming from a classical background, I love that. But for me, it just became much more natural to tell a story, because every time I was writing, a sonata or a fugue or something, for me the question was always, well, what's the story? What's the story that's propelling the music? And so for me, it became a natural transition into composing for some sort of story, whether it's of course with classical music we have operas and oratorios and things, but transitioning to short films and feature films and pretty much anything, I think, that has a story and that has a narrative of some sort that helps propel the music.
And were you exposed to films growing up? Is that,
Yeah, absolutely. My dad is a big film buff, and so I grew up watching Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments and all these amazing films and with amazing scores, Elmer Bernstein and of course Hitchcock and all that. So I did have a big film exposure from a young age, sort of parallel to my music. And I guess something that my mom would say a lot is that watching movies has always been much more natural to you than rehearsing music. So I guess it became a natural transition to do that. And in fact, at one point when I was figuring out what it is that I really wanted to do, I actually put music on hold for a bit and went in to study filmmaking.
Okay.
Because I knew I wanted to be in that realm. I wasn't exactly sure what exactly in film, but I really wanted to be in that world. And then obviously it made more sense to sort of combine the two.
And did you have any big influences growing up that made an impact on you, whether it be specific film composers or composers in general?
Well, I loved Lion King growing up, of course. So, of course, Hans Zimmer has always been a big influence.
Right.
In terms of just all of his scores and the breadth of his work. And then, studying more from interviews and kind of his process has been really amazing to follow and be influenced by. But I feel like I also have a lot of director influences, especially in the storytelling point of view. A lot of my influences are of course Hitchcock and Kubrick. One of my main directors that I just respect his work so much is of course Roman Polanski. Of
course, you talked to me about that,
and I just love the way he tells story. I think the silence is as much as important in a film composer's tools as everything else. And I think that from just studying his work and being influenced by it, there's a lot of that, and it makes you think a lot more about why there should be music here and why it should stop or start, and make him really count. There has to be a reason for everything and not just become wallpaper music.
Exactly, yeah.
So yeah, those are my main influences, and obviously, music-wise, I grew up loving Beethoven and Bach and Mahler and and of course Wagner, you know, for me Wagner and the way he wrote with leitmotifs and stuff really was almost like the grandfather of film scoring.
Yeah, it's very visual
very
music.
visual,
Yeah.
and very thematic,
Mm-hmm.
which I think you know, carries over into film.
And you mentioned you're from Thailand, and growing up there, you know, the culture and then the people, and you know, has that influenced your style, and have you kept that with you, and you know, when you write, or?
I think so. I grew up in a sort of an expat community of mainly Americans, but Europeans as well,
Right.
and so I felt like I feel like I grew up in a very international community. But the fact that I wasn't in America or England or an English-speaking country, I think, did have a big influence, because there's a lot more stuff going on, and so when I was in the classical community, you know, it's a very interesting blend of European, obviously, and with Thai, but also studying Thai, you know, ethnic music, traditional music.
Right.
And I grew up loving, you know, my dad used to put on CDs or cassette tapes at the time of Scottish Highland bagpipes.
Oh wow! Okay.
And so I grew up loving those, and you know, everything from like Nat King Cole to obviously Mahler and everyone else. So I think it did have an influence on because it was more of a melting pot.
Right.
than I think if I had grown up in an American town or something, it would have been more, I guess, more streamlined.
Yeah.
So yeah, it has a big influence, and I don't, you know, feel like I particularly write with, you know, a particularly Asian or Thai sensibility. But that's partially why I like films and stories, because I feel like I get to disappear into the story.
Exactly.
And so whatever it is that I'm doing, I try to disappear into that world, and almost like an actor would, you know, try to just be a part of it, and not necessarily comment on it, but just be a part of it. And so it you know, it depends on what type of project it is. But I think that the main influence from growing up there in that type of community is the fact that you come from a different perspective of everything. So that was
Start recording. Yeah. So, and then focusing on the storytelling aspect of music, which is, you know, what it's there for. When you're writing to picture, what is your major source of inspiration? Is it the characters, the setting, the plot? You know, what calls out to you the most? I mean, it's always a combination of all of them, but what's the primary thing that says, okay, I'm relating to this right now, and this is what's communicating to me?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from reading the script, and I usually start a lot of my projects earlier on, and I'll read the scripts a lot of the times before they would shoot, which is also in the case of Dragon Age was like that, and I think from the script and then from discussing with the director, you know, I would get a sense of what it is that I'm looking into. In the case of Dragon Age, I think one of the first things that I felt from reading it was that there's a huge sense of tone. And it depends on, you know, on again, of course, what story and what type of medium you're telling it in, or genre. I think in a fantasy or psychological thriller or horror, these are very visual, and there's a lot of tone involved in setting them. So a lot of the time in those particular genres, I would start off by just hearing colors or hearing specific tones, not necessarily melodies or themes yet, but tones of clusters of sounds. On a drama, you know, it's a little different, because dramas are usually more character. I mean, everything has character, but they're usually more based on intimate character situations. One of the films I just recently finished after Dragon Age is a period film called Croquembouche, and it's a intimate drama between several people, and an event that happened in their lives. So that focus was absolutely on the main character's point of view, and her development throughout the story, and her change, and but the most important thing always for me is story arc, is what's the arc of the story, and because of that, I usually start off writing a suite of music. Could be 5 or 6 minutes. It's gone up to 15 minutes of music that, to me, would certainly establish whatever tone it is that I feel the film should have, the score should have. But also exploring melodies and how they could develop. And usually these suites would mirror the script quite a lot. Obviously, if it's a feature, it's not mirroring every single thing that happens, but I would pick some of the main events.
So kind of like a condensed,
very condensed, basically like an outline, a treatment of the score, basically. When you're working on a 5-minute fight sequence, it's very easy to lose yourself in it for days and forget what the big picture is and what the story arc is and at what point of the story you're in and where it's going. So I always have that initial blueprint suite as something that I would come back to and remind myself of, here we are, this is where we are. But I also think, for me, music is a very much of a reaction. It's a lot about my reactions, my instinctual first look at
what you're feeling,
of what I'm feeling, and so I always really want to document that, because especially as we all know, in post-production things get very crazy, and you don't want to get sucked into all the other technicalities of scoring and forget what that initial idea is, but it happens, it happens. So it's very important for me to have that initial diary entry so that I could go back to.
And as a composer, you're evoking emotion through music, and in your opinion, what is the hardest emotion to evoke?
I think whatever is the deepest emotion for you, I think is the hardest. I think darker emotions tend to be harder, but more not more interesting, but something that I've explored a lot more, I think, in my work, in general, because I think the less there is, and the deeper the emotion is, the harder it is, because you have to say a lot more with very much less. And that was a similar case in the Croquembouche film I recently finished, and also the Traveler that I co-scored with my friend Anders from Norway. That was both of them are quite different. One of them is very psychological thriller, and the other is a period drama. But both of them have very deep emotions that aren't necessarily reflected on screen quite as much. It's very subtle performances, wonderfully subtle, but subtle. And that's where the Polanski kicks in. That's where it's much more about how to artistically tell this without beating it over the head, and leaving the audience just not necessarily giving everything away. Right. So there's all these things, all these barriers that you have to work with, and so usually those, I think, are the hardest. It doesn't matter if it's sad, or if it's dementia, or if it's anything like that. But I think it's just the depth of the character. I think it is, just because I feel like in a way, I'm almost like a method actor, where I feel like if whatever story I'm trying to tell, I have to put myself mentally into that mind frame. And so when you're exploring something very dark and potentially twisted, it gets hard to try and express that, because I feel there's, I'm sure somebody said this before, but it's not really about the notes, it's about what's behind it. And I think that's the toughest thing.
Right.
Is doesn't necessarily matter what notes well, obviously it does, musically and technically, but doesn't really matter. It's more what's behind it. And you put a lot of you into it. You have to, I think, to be able to express something truthfully.
You should write what you know.
Yeah,
that's always the thing. Even for not even music, just
anything.
Yeah.
And I think putting yourself out there and kind of letting yourself be very vulnerable, musically in our case, can be a very tough thing. So that usually is the thing.
Totally agree with all of that. And so as you started off, with this career, and with me going through school and making short films, you started with short films, and so now when you finally were able to tackle your first feature, which is a short film on steroids, but what was the biggest challenge for making that big leap, and was it too much to handle? How did you tackle that without going through the problems and the challenges?
Well, my first feature film that I scored on my own was Dark Woods, and that for me was a dream first feature. It was a project that I had heard about through a blog site that talks about upcoming exciting thrillers or dystopia films. And I just found out about it. They had their promotional reel on the cinematographer's site, and I just contacted him and I said, I love what you're doing. It looks amazing. I'd love to tell the story. And a few months later, I get a call from the producers, and they want a meeting, and so the director walks in, and the very first thing he said to me was, "Have you seen Let the Right One In?" Which of course I had, and it was and it still is one of my favorite films. And he said, "Oh, good, we're on the same page here." And so I think as a first feature, I creatively it was just fantastic, and I think we were always on the same page, and it was a very interesting way of working, because there was absolutely no temp music in the entire film,
which is rare.
It was, we all obviously had music that both the director and I, both Mike and I, liked and thought were suitable, but there was no music in the cut. And so I saw the film for the first time, and there was absolutely no music. So in a way it was really quite fun, because you start off with a blank slate. And in a way it's one of the very ideal situations film-wise that I've done. And I think we kind of went at it very guerrilla style. Because at the time, I didn't have a music editor. I didn't have lots of assistants. Not that I do now, but and there wasn't necessarily a traditional way of we spot the film and then do this and that. So it was really I got the film. We had lots of discussions. I had a piece of music that I'd written for a school project a year and a half before I got this film, that we had put up to picture the first time the director walked into the promotional trailer. And surprisingly, other than the fact that it was about 10 seconds too long, it fit the cut really, really well. So that became our sort of first piece of, this could work. So I sort of dissected it a little bit and just mainly utilized the first three notes of it, the F, D, and D flat. That became the main three notes in the Dark Woods score. but really it was me, you know, it was again me reacting very guerrilla style of just having the picture on the screen and just kind of playing and that was really, I mean, the first take for the opening title, that was the opening titles. And then very few takes later, that became the main theme at the end. So when we found that, we went through the rest, but we never spotted it really. It was that's why I say guerrilla style. It was more like just kind of. It was a very much like a family atmosphere, which is what I loved about it. Was that we just, you know, mainly the director, mainly Mike and I in the room, and I had my friend Kasha, who also helped out with me and played cello on it and stuff. But we basically, it was just sort of all of us sitting in and together, and I would say I think there should be music here and here and here. And my first pass, and he was very trusting, and he just said, basically, you know, do what you feel is right. So, you know, my first score passover, where I would just, you know, place pieces in to where I felt was right. There was very little music in the film. There was about, say, 25 minutes in an hour and a half film. So I didn't approach it because I was very, very conscious of not over scoring it. Especially in that film, and that was one of the main conversations that Mike and I had throughout most of it. Was how can you tell it, because it's a very intimate story. It's a very psychological story, and you know, I wanted there to be, you know, not overpowering a lot of music. And so I think the score that we ended up with was a really great balance of because I also worked on the sound design with them, and we also wanted to blend that. And so it became a good blend, I think, of sound design aspects, but with the piano themes and very minimal and not big and overpowering.
Well, I guess shows a lot of restraint on your part. I think to be your first feature film, you're just saying, all right, we're going to do what's right from the film instead of like, let me just fill us with as much music as I can.
Yeah, and I think on every project, for me, I always approach it as I'm a filmmaker as well, and I'm trying to tell this story. So let's figure out what the best way to tell the story is. In my case, with music, and of course to adhere to what your director's vision is. But that's always the foremost thing in my mind, is not necessarily that I'm a composer and I'm composing lots of music, but that I'm a storyteller, and I'm adding my particular side of storytelling to this piece of storytelling. And so you feel more like you're part of it, as opposed to just adding stuff to it, which I think is an important kind of way to approach it, I think, at least for me.
Now, you composed the score for Dragon Age Redemption, which is the web series based off the hit EA BioWare video game. And now the web series is 6 episodes. So did you approach scoring it as an episodic narrative, like one episode at a time, or did you embrace it all as one big cohesive piece?
So fortunately, we knew what the whole series was going to be before we started, and I read the whole script, and I was actually on board early. I was on board in January on set. So I've been there through most, except for pre-production, I've been there for most of the process. But knowing the whole thing, we pretty much approached it as a one big film. And I wrote the opening, I started writing themes before there was any footage. So I again, kind of starting off with those suites and those different ideas, was how I started. But then once we started getting picture in, naturally picture started coming in episode 1 first. So I started mainly focusing on that, and then jumped all the way to the end and focused on episode 6, which is our big finale. Because I think especially in this particular story, I think in any story really, but I think in this particular story very much so, there's a huge arc in the storytelling. There's a lot of development, and it was very important for me to follow all of that and make sure I knew how we were ending up, so that I could go back in and fill in the pieces of development. So really I approached it much more like one full piece, and because it wasn't a situation as in a typical television series where you'd have a few episodes perhaps, but then they would start airing them, and then you basically would just do it as they come in. But it was mainly approached as a full thing, and when we recorded the score, we recorded the entire series at the same time, and then mixed it all at the same time. So it just you got all the footage after everything, which they shot all 6 episodes at the same time, so it wasn't like we did one episode and the next. So it was just kind of one big thing. Yeah, it was just basically one big film that's broken up in terms of the actual releasing of it. But I mean, obviously there's a lot of differences. That being said, there's a lot of differences between telling a normal feature film or a film of that length and it being episodic. So the fact that it was episodic, even though I worked on it as a full and approached it as a regular story arc, there was a lot more. There's a very different sensibility to creating the score, and being a web series particularly, there's a lot more attention grabbing that has to be done and kept. Because anybody can just click off of it. So there's actually quite a lot more music in Dragon Age than most of all my other films or projects. But also, of course, being in the fantasy realm, there's there's room to play. So that worked nicely with the style of what we were telling. Right. And of course, Dragon Age is based on the video games, which has a huge fan base, and it's such a well-known franchise, especially for Zur's scores. Yes. Who is an amazing video game composer. Absolutely. So I'm sure you've played through the games and everything. Yes, and did you try to build off the universe he created, or did you just kind of start from a clean slate and say, all right, I'm kind of branching out doing this? Well, I absolutely played both games because I wanted to be part of this world. I felt like what we were doing is a new tangent in it. It's a new story within this world. But it was very important to me that, and I think everyone involved, that we needed to be part of the world and not tangent off and create a completely different thing. And so we, the bum 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 of Enon's original score is actually in the opening of our series. I've certainly put my own spin to it, but we certainly did that. And I think in general with the rest of the score, I was keeping in mind of what Enon did, but at the same time, of course, Talus is a fresh character, and this is really her story, and as we all know at this point, it ties into the new DLC, which she is in. So even though keeping in mind that I wanted to be part of the world that Enon had created musically speaking, I felt like I was able to take some liberties in creating a new sound for Talus and this story that we were telling. And it was actually really nice of BioWare to include the score from the series as part of the new DLC. That follows Talus back into the world. Oh, so your music is going to be now back in the game. It's back in the game now. That's exciting. So that was very exciting, and I was glad that they liked the thing that I did, and the fact that Talus is now in the game as well, that they
Right.
felt like they wanted to bring my sound for her into that as well was really nice.
So you didn't compose anything new for the game. They just took.
No,
Right.
we basically provided them with all the whole score
Okay.
for the series, and they utilized it in the game.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's quite fun. I still need to hear it.
Yeah.
In the game.
So now we're sitting in your very beautiful studio here, Alkaloide Music Productions. Tell me how this came to be, and this is your studio, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, we moved into this space. I think 3 years ago now.
Wow.
And I've always wanted. I've always not liked sunlight. So as you'll see, all the windows are blocked off.
Yeah.
But I also, one of the main reasons because of that I did that is, and I did that in my previous studio as well, is because for me I need my studio to be a place where I can spend endless hours and be out of reality, out
Right.
of the real world. And I needed to not know when the sun was coming up or when anything else was happening in the world. And so I needed to create that for me. And I love the sort of the wood and the mahogany and crimson and old world feel, very Victorian or European. I mean, I coming from a classical music history background. I was in Prague for a little bit and just loved the atmosphere,
Right.
and so for me it was very natural to decorate it like that and to have that with amongst all the technology that we have in here, but to have that thing, and I think that in a way represents sort of what I try and do with my scores as well, as to try and tell whatever story, of course, that I'm telling, but to utilize traditional means, traditional, perhaps classical or whatever, organic means to tell a story, but with a fresh perspective and with a modern perspective, and utilizing the amazing new technological advances that we have to tell the story. And so in a way, that's sort of, I think, what the studio has become for me, is that there's a lot of traditional, there's the piano and books and actual paper and things, but there's a lot of also the new technology as part of that. So.
Well, it's beautiful. So
Thank you.
It feels like a home, and as I think the important thing, I think it feels like a home. So which is important. Yes. So I guess as we're wrapping things up, just in general speaking, have you heard anything good this year? Have you any favorites, any scores, any movies?
Well, there's a lot of films that I'm very much looking forward to.
Right, there's still 2 months left.
There's still 2 months left of Oscar season.
Exactly.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing Polanski's Carnage.
Of course.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing Cronenberg's Dangerous Method, of which I love the score. But a score is always about how it works to picture.
Exactly. Yeah.
So even though I like it on tape or CD, I want to see how it's utilized. I'm very excited about Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
No, I can't wait for that. Yeah.
And of course, I'm very excited for The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Being a fan of the original very much.
Right.
And also loving what Trent and Atticus did in Social Network. I'm very excited to hear what they do in this. The one film I did see that I absolutely loved, and it has been my favorite film this year, is Pedro Almodovar's The Skin I Live In.
This is amazing. I think it's the best score of the year so far.
I think it's certainly the best score that I've heard so far, and it's the best film that I've seen so far.
Yeah.
Not having seen all the other ones I've just listed. But it's such an amazing film, and the score, I think, is riveting. It's such
Iglesias. Oh.
Yes. Who also scored Tinker Tailor.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a few of his going on here.
So is there anything? I know you being a composer, you can't talk about it a lot. But is there anything you can talk about that you're working on right now? Or is it all still under tight lip wrap?
Well, I'm working on a short Canadian project with a friend of mine, Chad Rook, who's a wonderful actor and director, and he for fans of sci-fi and stuff will know him. He would guest star on Sanctuary, which I really enjoyed, and that's how I met him actually, was through Sanctuary. But so I'm working on a project for him, and have a whole list of scripts here that I've been reading. I'm starting. One of the exciting projects that I can't say much about yet, but my friend Jason Charles Miller, who fans would know him from the band Godhead, that was signed to Manson's label for a while. He actually was my musical confidant on Dragon Age. He was my music editor. He played guitar on it. He sang on it, and he just came out with his new album, and is performing in Nashville right now. But he and I are scoring a few films together. Wow. Collaborating on some stuff.
So I guess I always like to end my interviews with this question for composers. If you had the opportunity to score any film ever made, with no disrespect to the original composer, what film would you choose?
For me, I think it would have to be Let the Right One In.
No, okay, that's a good one. You've already heard Giacchino's versions.
Yes, exactly. But to rescore the original.
Right.
I think Johann Söderqvist is one of my main influences as a composer today, and I love his sensibility, and more than that, I love the sensibility of the film, and I think it being my favorite film, I just relate to it more in a very personal level. Of course, I love Lord of the Rings and everything else as well, but I think Let the Right One In hits home very deeply, and so for me, it would be very tricky, and to come up to write it, and especially because Johann's score has been something that's influenced me on quite a lot of things, and I was able to have the pleasure of chatting with him briefly a while ago, and but I think the story is it's universal, and I think it's not dark and not light, and that's what I love about it. I think it's a film that is universal, and a film that cannot necessarily be categorized in a particular genre. And I like that. I
agree with that. It's not a horror film. It's
not a romance per se. It's a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And I think that for me would be a really amazing challenge, is to score something that has so much depth of character and depth of story, and how you would tell that. And obviously, I really enjoyed what Matt Reeves did with the remake, and what Giacchino did in his score. So yeah, it'd be interesting for me to explore that, and it'd be a big challenge. But I'd love to do something like that.
That's a great answer. So.
Thank you.
Well, Peace, thank you so much
for
the time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me in your studio. And we'll definitely do this again in the future.
I'd love to, yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.